By executive order, I proclaim that all members of the debate track community must hit the like button. It's rare and welcome when the topic that I want to discuss is the same topic that we actually do discuss. For March 2022, for example, we discussed organic farming as Russian troops amassed for the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. At the time, it seemed absurd. Now, the showman president has again made the whole world seem absurd, but at least we'll talk it through in the debate rounds. I got a chance to see President Trump speak in the last campaign stop of this past election run in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I've also seen Bush Jr. speak, and Obama and Bernie. The reaction of the crowd in Van Andel Arena compared to those famous yet measured politicians was like watching 100 gorillas fighting a full-grown adult man. It paled them by orders of magnitude, in no small part because the 12,000-seat arena was actually filled, with thousands standing outside, despite the fact that he started speaking after midnight on a weekday. The only other time I've witnessed fans eat such levels of disrespect was at a Snoop Dogg show. One of my neighbors called it the local Nuremberg rally. Looking at footage of these rallies, that seems about right. The cultural phenomenon is one aspect, but the political is a whole other one. This topic lets us explore what's happening in the presidency now, and how far it could go, while simultaneously giving the devil his due. We are 110 days into a planned 4 years. What we debate over the coming months will be crucial in understanding how things will unfold. May we all stay disobedient. Please listen for the next 2 minutes. These announcements are a little bit different from normal. First, all evidence cited can be found at debatetrack.com. Purchasing a brief is the best way to support this channel, so thank you for doing that. Second, all evidence cited in this lecture is cut and edited for clarity. It's not read verbatim. Third, this is your last topic of the season, the national topic. So if you don't want to continue your brief subscription, then cancel that subscription, please. Fourth, for all graduating seniors and even for juniors, please stay till the end or skip to the end for a special brief message. Last, I would like to shout out the biggest supporter of this channel since day one, Stephen Brooks. He's currently receiving treatment for leukemia, or just finished it up, and the Bay Area debate community that he's fostered for 20 years has been incredibly supportive. We should follow suit. If these lectures have been useful to you, I urge you to go support him. His GoFundMe is in the description. Even if it's only $5, it would make a big difference just showing up for someone who's done so much for the public forum community. Shout out to Stephen. Shout out to Brooks Debate Institute. Wishing you all the best. And now, executive orders. I'll admit this topic is a large and confusing and disorienting topic. The topic area is correct. For the first few days of research, I thought I was just missing something in the chaos, but now I actually think it's just maybe a poorly worded topic. As Peter Shane, an American legal scholar, put it in an email to me, for what it's worth, debating executive orders as such may be a little puzzling, like a debate whether statutes are a good thing. Presidents are going to issue orders. I've cut well over 100 pages for the brief, but still don't have a cogent theory of how to approach the affirmative. I admit there's a good chance I'm just missing something obvious, so if you have something to add on arguments or strategy, don't be shy, please throw it in the comments. With that, we will start on background. Here is your resolution. On balance, in the United States, the benefits of presidential executive orders outweigh the harms. Executive orders are written commands made by the president to direct management operations of the federal government. This is in contrast with presidential proclamations, which are more ceremonial or symbolic, like declaring National Volunteer Week or National Park Week. The word presidential limits us to the federal government. Other executives can issue EOs, for example, mayors or governors, but for this topic, we are just talking about federal-level presidential EOs. Last, benefits and harms. 2 points here. One, there are questions about the legality and constitutionality of executive orders. A straight reading of the resolution ignores many of these questions. Legal is not the same thing as beneficial. Many legal things are harmful, and vice versa. 420 blaze it. Second point, we can analyze the EOs at different levels, specifically two. First level, the specific EOs issued. We could analyze the resolution by lining up all 15,000 executive orders ever made, putting all the harms on one side, all the benefits on the other side. And this might be a little bit tempting because there's so many executive orders that make it into the news, especially the bad ones. So we might want to talk about all of the specific good things and all the specific bad things that they've done. However, more cogent rounds will prefer the second level of analysis, the general principles behind the executive orders. This is the bird's eye or meta view of what they imply for our government. Michael McConnell writes in a blurb about his book, The President Who Would Not Be King. One of the most vexing questions for the framers of the Constitution was how to create a vigorous and independent executive without making him king. This topic explores this tension. You might also conceptualize the resolution as follows. On balance, in the United States, the benefits of a strong executive branch outweigh the harms. Now, don't prepare this resolution. That's not the resolution, but that is, I believe, the core question we should discuss here. There's an analogy that ChatGPT came up with in describing these two levels of analysis, specific and general. Focusing on specific executive orders is like judging whether someone should have a loaded gun based on whether they've used it to shoot a burglar or open a beer bottle. The real question isn't how they've used it, it's whether they should be carrying it at all. Now, here's a basic question. What do executive orders actually do? The 15,000 executive orders so far written have a broad range. BBC 25. Orders range from dramatic reverses of policy, like Trump's approval for the construction of 2 bitterly contested oil pipelines in 2017, to ordinary business, such as Barack Obama's instructions on half-day closing for government departments on Christmas Eve. Broadly speaking, here's some of the things that executive orders can do. The president is tasked with carrying out the laws that Congress makes. One way they can do that is through executive order, enforcing this legislation. For example, 11246 was issued by Lyndon Johnson to prohibit federal contractors from discriminating based on race, religion, sex, or other protected characteristics. This supported the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And George W.'s 13224 authorized the Treasury to seize assets of suspected terrorists, supporting the IEEPA law. Laws are often vague, though, and the president has discretion about how the laws are carried out. These policy choices can be fine-tuned via executive order. For example, Clinton's 13166 required federal agencies to provide access to those with limited English capabilities. This interpreted the Civil Rights Act provision for national origin to include language-based discrimination. Biden's 14008 established climate-related goals for procurement and infrastructure, linking existing laws, like the Clean Air Act, to coordinate and accelerate agency actions. In each of these cases, the president expanded an existing law. In the case of Trump's 14210, the Doge order, Trump aimed to restrict a number of laws by cutting and downsizing federal departments. Probably perfectly legal, as while Congress says these departments must exist, the president can determine much of their scope. Even though they may walk and talk like laws, executive orders aren't technically laws. Therefore, they can be overturned by another president's executive order. There's another thing EOs can do: overturn. For example, Trump's 13792 removed some protections for national monuments put in place by Clinton, Bush Jr., and Obama administrations to expand their use for oil and mineral development. And Obama's 13492 revoked Bush's 13440, which itself allowed the government to keep al-Qaeda and Taliban suspects at Guantanamo Bay. Obama's order sought to release prisoners held there and close the facility. The National Emergencies Act of 1976 allows the president to declare an emergency via executive order. This is by convention because, again, EOs are just the normal way the presidents communicate their orders. The NEA gives the president pretty extreme power, specifically 136 emergency powers they don't usually have. This includes suspending restrictions on chemical and biological weapons, suspending the Clean Air Act, authorizing military construction, drafting retired military members, seizing communications infrastructure, freezing Americans' bank accounts and property, seizing industry, and using U.S. troops for domestic law enforcement. An example, Bill Clinton used 13119 to declare a national emergency related to Kosovo, and used the NEA's emergency powers to seize assets from the governments of Yugoslavia, Serbia, and Montenegro. Now, EOs cannot create new laws, not on paper, but in practice. Paul Begala, President Bill Clinton's former advisor, summed up the power of modern executive orders when he said, "Stroke of the pen, law of the land." Kind of cool. We might then look at the counterfactual world without executive orders. If the EO were abolished, what powers would the president still have? Again, this is not the question that the resolution asks, but it is a useful one to ask. So, without executive orders, presidents would still have enormous powers. First, commander-in-chief. Although only Congress can officially declare war, the president can do many things with the military, can order airstrikes, deployments, covert operations. Under the War Powers Resolution of 1973, the president can deploy troops for up to 60 days without congressional authorization, which is plenty of time to become deeply embroiled in a conflict and to pound the media with enough propaganda that Congress is politically forced to approve your war. Second, appointments and removals. The president is the head of the administrative state, but each department also has a head, and hiring and firing the people in those roles is a hugely consequential part of being president. This includes the secretaries of defense, agriculture, commerce, health, housing, transportation, and others, along with the attorney general, the director of national intelligence, and various other administrators. Together, these are all called the president's cabinet. What else can they do? They can approve and veto legislation from Congress. So after Congress passes a law, the president also gets a vote. They can approve the law or veto it. This check on Congress is another crucial way they can exert their influence. Presidents also wield immense personal influence as legitimized head of state. This includes directing agencies informally through memos or phone calls or letters, public speeches and press conferences to push Congress to act in a certain way, and acts of diplomacy and foreign affairs in relations with other countries. So tons of things. Obviously, the president himself as a person, one day herself as a person, can do because they are the president. So in short, it seems that even in the absence of the executive order, our president would still have plenty of powers to exert over the country. Next, legality. Although, again, the resolution doesn't ask about legality, there's no doubt that the question will come up in debate rounds. Are executive orders legal? The Constitution gives support for the idea of the executive order. Article 2 gives broad executive authority to determine how to enforce law and manage resources to the president. Quote, "The executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States of America. He shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed." The Constitution here references the law. The law is made by Congress. Therefore, executive orders must be supported by Congress, either expressly, with actual written laws delineating the EO, or implied by writing laws which EOs can then go on to support. Again, at least in theory, executive orders cannot create new laws. So that's the constitutional basis. Next, presidential immunity. In Trump v. US, the Supreme Court ruled that President Trump and presidents in general have absolute immunity for official acts, thus clearing him of the federal grand jury indictment of charges relating to overthrowing the election. As it stands then, a president can issue any executive order they want, regardless of its legality, and not be charged with a crime. Executive orders are, of course, official acts. And again, total immunity for official acts. Sure, people can sue to stop the order itself from being carried out. Hey, this is illegal, we shouldn't do it, fine. But the president faces no risk in testing the waters to his heart's content. I hope you're happy, Supreme Court. Next, the process. Where do they come from? Where do they go? First question, who actually writes all these executive orders? From what I can gather, who writes them is a mix of administrative staffers, so people working for the president, lawyers, and special interest groups. Lately, that means Project 2025 and the Heritage Foundation, but it could be any group that has an issue they want to press, along with access to the president to actually give them that EO. I couldn't actually find a card that answers this question succinctly. For anyone studying poli-sci or journalism, this would be a great question to delve into for publication. I didn't find a card, but I did find quotes on the internet. Even better. Here's from the Straight Dope message board, user Kronos. The short answer is whoever the president wants. In theory, you or I could write to the president and say, here's the text of an executive order I'd like you to issue, and he would look at it and say, yeah, that's a great idea, and sign it. So, it seems about right. From what I can gather, they all have to go through lawyers to ensure that they have some legal justification at least, and maybe pass through the Office of Legal Counsel for legal review. There are, however, two things I could find about Trump's recent spate of executive orders specifically, and while his recent flurry does set a record for the first 100 days, 142 executive orders, it also likely sets a precedent for what to expect in the future. You know, the next president, if we have a next president, will likely do the same thing, hundreds of executive orders in the first 100 days. So here's what I could find. First, the executive orders were drafted in advance of his being sworn in on January 20th. This is probably obvious. You can't come up with a pile of 142 documents the day of or even the week of. Wilhelm 24, quote, many presidential candidates promise day one actions while on the campaign trail. The only way to act so quickly is to have orders prepared in advance for the signature of a new president. Second, many of these executive orders were likely written with AI. Dupre 25, quote, legal experts have called attention to some curious common threads, bizarre typos, formatting errors and oddities, and stilted language, familiar artifacts that have led to speculation that those who penned them might have turned to AI for help. Slate journalist and legal expert Mark Joseph Stern remarked that these actions were obviously assisted by AI. End quote. Next, what happens after an EO is written and signed? Executive orders don't have expiration dates, so they remain in place until one of the three branches of government remove them. Presidents can revoke, modify, or make exceptions to EOs at any time. In fact, presidents often reverse their predecessors' EOs, and often within the first 100 days of their presidency. During the 2020 election cycle, Elizabeth Warren planned, quote, to undo Trump's executive orders, which were designed to undo Obama's executive orders, which were, you get the idea. That's 10 or 19. Take the Paris Climate Agreement. Trump just pulled out of the agreement via EO. That overturns the Biden EO. That overturned the Trump 1 EO. That overturned the Obama EO, which entered us into the U.S. Paris Agreement in the first place. This is called, appropriately, the EO pendulum. While presidents can reverse policies laid out in an EO, they can't always reverse the outcomes of those policies. Lewand and Pozansky, 24, detailed this, quote, facilities sold to the private sector cannot be easily reclaimed. Declassified information cannot be made a government secret again. Suppose a president would like to open up a federally controlled area to offshore oil drilling. They sign an executive order that leads to leases and resource extraction. If this EO is overturned by another president, the oil will not be returned to the earth, and the effects on the surrounding ocean ecosystem will remain. End quote. Finally, presidents sometimes cancel past executive orders as a kind of cleanup. Again, they don't expire, so cleanup sessions are undertaken periodically to remove EOs that are just no longer relevant. It's not political, they just don't want all of these EOs on the books forever. Congress cannot veto an EO directly, but they can create legislation that makes the order illegal. The president, however, can veto this legislation. Now, the Congress, and here's the fun part, can veto the president's veto, thus passing the anti-EO legislation anyway. But this requires a 2/3 supermajority of Congress, which is practically impossible, as Congresspeople almost always vote along party lines when it comes to president's decisions. So to sum up this mess succinctly, Congress can't really do anything about an executive order unless it is so bad that it makes Congresspeople work across the aisle, which would be pretty damn bad. final check, we all hope, is the courts. Courts have much more power to rule executive orders illegal. This is because a court decision is just whatever the presiding judge decides, and that's only one person. It's much easier to get one person to agree with themselves than it is to get 500 some odd Congress people to agree with each other. Here's Hawkins 25, quote, "It's important to remember that EOs do not have the force of law. Federal courts possess the sole authority to determine what conduct is illegal or unlawful," end quote. However, courts deciding to strike down an EO is historically rare. Since the advent of executive orders, courts have only struck down 14 of the 14,000-ish published executive orders as of October of last year. But that number is now considerably higher. For example, a federal court just struck down 14230, Trump's targeting of law firm Perkins Coie. And there is a Washington Examiner article, which is uncut, entitled 11 Trump executive orders that have been struck down, suggesting that the current Trump term has nearly doubled the number of EOs that courts have rescinded throughout American history. And this pattern of Trump's executive orders being challenged in court is likely to continue. Which in Tempest, quote, "The more things you do, the more opportunities there are to create plaintiffs, and some percentage of those plaintiffs sue. So this is going to be a litigation-heavy environment for the next 2 years." Now, these decisions will continue to roll out as we debate this topic. As recently as May 6th, today filming this on May 11th, and I'm not cutting any fresh evidence after this, a judge issued an injunction against a series of executive orders targeting support services for libraries, museums, minority businesses, and mediation services. According to Hodling, U.S. District Judge McConnell wrote that Trump's order blatantly ignored the separation of powers and violated the Administrative Procedure Act in the arbitrary and capricious way it was carried out. It also disregards the fundamental constitutional role of each of the branches of our federal government, end quote. So, courts are the only place an executive order by a current administration can be challenged. Legally speaking, they remain an important check on the president's powers. In practical terms, though, the current administration has already defied at least one court order by refusing to return Abrego Garcia from the El Salvadorian gulag that he is now sending people to. Whether the president is in the right or not, his defiance of the court order is a precedent that we may see pushed even further in the coming years. We're only 1/12 of the way through this presidency, and it has been a wrecking ball. And another thing to note, that as the executive gathers more and more power throughout each presidency, that power is passed on to the next president. So whatever degree Trump is able to push the executive power within the next 4 years, including just ignoring courts, that is the precedent that will be set for the next president in the future. He ignores the courts, that means all future presidents can ignore the courts. Okay. Let's take a very short jaunt through the history of executive orders. Again, there's thousands and thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of executive orders, well, over 10,000 executive orders, I suppose. So we're not going to cover all of them. You can do that on your own time. All presidents have used executive orders, or some equivalent. The one exception is William Henry Harrison. He's an exception in many presidential lists, though, like the list of presidents to serve more than 1 month, or a list of presidents who didn't die in office after 1 month. On that note, comment your favorite president in the comment. I'll give you extra credit if you do. The current executive order naming system started in 1907 with backdating to 1862, which was an Abraham Lincoln order relating to political prisoners. So you can technically make the case that executive orders started in 1907 or 1862, but in the literature, it's generally accepted that we can call any written executive order like presidential command an executive order, even if they were called something else at the time that they were written. This just keeps some consistency, even though the names and the terms change throughout history. So if it seems like an executive order historically, then it is. That's kind of the literary consensus. Okay, so with that in mind, the first EO was written by George Washington. In the order, he asked the heads of the executive departments to describe their jobs and the current situation of the Union, essentially giving him an overview of where the government was at the time. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, an executive order which began the end of slavery in the United States. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt issued 6102, forbidding the hoarding of gold coin and limiting the amount of gold Americans could own to $100. Many were prosecuted for hoarding gold, and the prohibition was only lifted by an act of Congress signed by Gerald Ford in 1964. In 1942, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, targeting Japanese, Germans, and Italians in America, and spurring the internment of Japanese Americans on the West Coast. In 1948, Truman signed Executive Order 9981, integrating the armed forces. In terms of sheer numbers, the wartime presidents Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt take the lead, with Roosevelt signing 3,721 executive orders during his 12 years in office. Pictured here are the numbers of executive orders from Washington to Obama. As you can see, despite recent attention, the numbers have dropped dramatically. Despite their high numbers of first 100 days executive orders, Biden and Trump have objectively been kind of middle of the road in terms of the sheer number of EOs. Thrower 21, quote, against conventional wisdom, presidents have relied less on executive orders over time. Indeed, modern presidents used dramatically fewer orders per year, an average of 59, than their pre-World War II counterparts who averaged 314. That said, they have been steadily rising as of late. Quote, over the past 3 presidencies, each president has raised the average number of executive orders by 20. Obama averaged 35 per year, Trump averaged 55 per year, and in his first year in office, Biden has executed 79 executive orders. That is the Democratic Erosion Consortium 22. This graph shows the number of EOs issued in the first 100 days in office. Trump has issued a lot of EOs for the first 100 days for recent presidents. But, of course, sheer numbers mean very little. If anything, what really matters is what's on the inside. Well, the numbers of executive orders are nowhere near their all-time high. The powers the president commands through them are larger than ever, with EOs becoming the de facto power of the president to write new laws as Congress abdicates its law-writing responsibilities to the executive branch. We can blame this on greed, laziness, and a practical approach to governance. First reason that Congress has given the executive so much power to make law, greed. Congress people are all too happy to have a strong executive with all the bloated powers of the executive order when their party is in power. Biden, for example, likely overstepped his powers for EOs by providing student debt relief. And Trump overstepped his powers with the Muslim ban and ban on diversity training. And of course, both parties have used the EO to expand presidential power itself, like Clinton's national emergency powers expansion and Bush Jr.'s limiting access to presidential records. So neither side has a real incentive to rein in the powers of the executive because when their party holds office, they can use it to get away with quite a bit. Here's Tanner19 talking about Democrats' reactions to Trump's first turn. Barrels of ink and countless hours of news time have been devoted to President Trump's casual embrace of authoritarianism, with good cause. Yet, out on the campaign trail, the Democratic presidential aspirants have been quick to embrace a view of almost unlimited presidential power. Sadly, Democratic complaints seem to boil down to Trump using that power for policies that the Democrats disagree with. They are all too happy to grab that power for their own purposes. End quote. Second reason for this move of power from Congress to the executive is what I might call laziness or understaffing. I mean, I just think laziness sounds cooler. Bosch 21 talks about Congress's reduced role in lawmaking and chalks it up to congressional capacity. Congressional staffing levels have declined since the mid-90s, reducing their ability to create new laws. They just don't got enough people to make the laws. Quote, as Congress does less, a power vacuum develops that the executive branch fills, end quote. And this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Bosch cites the example of Representative Maxine Waters, chairwoman of the Committee on Financial Services, who sent President Biden a 45-page letter with recommended executive actions rather than writing the laws herself and getting them passed through her own Congress and her own committee. Quote, "The fact that the head of a major congressional committee would be willing to abdicate a role in setting durable policies in the committee's area of jurisdiction signifies Congress's acknowledgement of its diminished role in policymaking." End quote. And last, practicality. The reason Maxine Waters may have been eager to have Biden pass executive orders is because in an age of partisanship and congressional gridlock, executive orders may be the only surefire way to get things done. The USA is a large and powerful empire. We have a constitution that lays out the correct way to do things, and that's all fine and good, but ultimately, if Congress isn't working, the gears of the empire need to keep moving. For example, illegal immigration into the country has been pretty wild. Americans on both sides of the aisle, just common sense, normal Americans, want some kind of border control instead of 250,000 illegal immigrants entering in a single month. Given that Congresspeople largely refuse to work across the aisle on this issue, perhaps it's a good thing that a strong executive can rein in ongoing issues and bring border crossings down to a historical 7,000 per month, 35 times less than peak Biden crossings. So, it's practical. It works. Something has to be done. They can do it with an executive order. Next, let's take a brief and cursory, very cursory, primer on the following question. What is the president supposed to be? Answering this question can help put us into some kind of context where we're at right now and these arguments that we'll be talking about. So this is kind of a historical development of how the different theories that have justified the president gaining more and more and more power over time. So to start, we have the Whig theory, the president as clerk, not leader. This theory, dominant in the 19th century, says the president should only do what the Constitution explicitly allows. This is what a president might look like in essence without the executive order. The stewardship theory. Here, the president is representative of the people. Under this theory, popularized by Teddy Roosevelt, the president should be assertive and proactive, acting for the public good instead of just following orders from the Constitution. The prerogative theory, the president as guardian of the system. Here, the president may occasionally violate constitutional or political norms if it's in the best interest of the nation. Abraham Lincoln, for example, suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War to preserve the Union. Like, yeah, you shouldn't suspend habeas corpus, but if, this is a situation where your country is breaking into two parts, maybe it's justified. Looking back on it, we can say, yeah, thanks, Abe Lincoln. The unitary theory. This is the president as executive. This theory, this approach, I guess, from Reagan and Bush Jr. especially, of the presidency, holds that the president has ultimate control over the executive. Still, there are some supposed limits. First, the law still matters. They have to follow it. Congressional oversight still matters, subjecting the president to hearings, subpoenas, and funding powers. Independent agencies like the Department of Justice still act largely independently. Granted, some of this may have been a veneer of legitimacy, but these presidents at least gave deference to ideas like the separation of powers. Now, this is the president that I am used to, the presidential theory that I've grown up with, Clinton, Bush, Obama, where the president has far too much power. There's a lot of discussions about the executive power and its bloated role and how maybe we need some kind of rebalancing. But again, the system from the outside looks like it's working properly to some degree. The pieces are moving as they should move, legally speaking. President as executive. The maximalist theory has the president as king. The current administration, empowered by the Trump v. U.S. ruling, which established presidential immunity and expanded the presidential powers in other ways, is taking an even more expansive, again, a maximally expansive interpretation of the presidency. Goldsmith 225, he's the learned hand professor at Harvard Law School, has an excellent discussion on this that I've put in the background section of the brief. He quotes legal scholar Adrian Vermeule in the piece, quote, "When subordinate executive officials exercise delegated discretion under otherwise valid statutory grants of authority, they are exercising executive power. Hence, they exercise not their own power, but that of the president. There is no such thing as executive power given to subordinate officials or administrative agencies in their own right. There is only ever the executive power of the president, which alone incarnates and gives legal life to the legal authority of all of his subordinates." He then offers this analogy to Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. Leviathan is itself composed of many smaller bodies. By the same token, it encompasses and includes them. So too, by analogy, the president as Leviathan encompasses all subordinate executive officials. The president is not only the head of the executive branch, but also its whole body. In contemplation of the law, there is no executive power that lies outside the presidency. Under this theory, the entire executive branch exists solely to serve the president. The lawyers of the Justice Department are the president's personal lawyers. Federal law enforcement are the president's personal security force. Under this theory, there should be no friction between the president's will and the actions of the executive. The man himself is the body of the executive branch. Here, laws become meaningless. Congress becomes an ancient artifact. Even the courts can be ignored. What are they going to do about it? The U.S. Marshals, the court's enforcement wing, is under the executive branch. Those are the president's cops. There is no independence. There is no separation. There is only the president king. We can balance this with another Goldstein card from the New York Times, which states that this has been a slow build over time, and this, rather than being entirely novel to Trump, quote, "President Trump's wrecking ball second term has revealed the full latent power of the presidency." And I should add that while this theory has yet to be fully actualized, it is very well on its way to being actualized. And again, if history is any precedent, there's no going back. Even if we switch characters, switch parties, there's no going back. Once the king is established, why have elections? But if we do have elections, we elect a new king. A final call out while we're still in the background section. All executive orders are filed in the Federal Register. I'll throw a link in the description. I encourage you to visit there and go read through some of the orders so you get an idea of how they're structured and what they look like. Here's a few things you may notice in scrolling through. First, notice that a lot of the names of the EOs sound pretty benign. Improving the safety and security of biological research. I mean, hey, that sounds good. But then you click on them and read them only to find out, oh, wait, the text is also benign. But then you go to research the actual implications of the policy, and then you find out, oh, well, this is actually like pretty good and helpful. I say all this because I've read some horrible things about several recent EOs, for example, reforming accreditation to strengthen higher education. But after reading the actual text of the EO, it just seems well justified and a practical move to make our lives better. Not to excuse them, some of these are also written with the bile of Satan's infected spleen directly on the skin of the eternally damned. But for a topic like this, we do have to take each one in turn. The last thing you may notice is that the executive orders change throughout time. Notably, while past presidents' EOs have been largely legalistic in their writing style, Trump's EOs are less formal and more propagandistic. So we can take a look at a Harry Truman executive order from 1951, establishing the President's Commission on Health Needs. And I haven't seen this. This is a blind reaction, but I can nearly guarantee you that this will not be pleasant, light summertime reading. So, yes, some justification up front, but a lot of it quite legalistic. And this is what you'll see, at least as far as I've seen, going back, even just, as far as Biden, that we'll go to 2023. Just referencing other laws, laying things out. Again, very exactly and legalistically. Again, with Trump's, they have a lot better copywriting, I guess, for the most part. Much better justifications for what they're actually doing. Writing in first person, for example. So if you need to justify one of Trump's EOs specifically, look no further than the EO text itself, at least as a start, which provides a number of justifications up front for why it's being written. Before getting into proper arguments, a couple notes on strategy. The first question is on benefits and harms. There are two types, as we have already discussed. Specific benefits and harms, like EO123 establishes a puppy squishing factory, and that's bad, or EO456 establishes universal healthcare, and that's good. So that's a specific benefit, specific harm from specific executive orders. Then there's general benefits and harms. Executive orders make the executive branch too powerful and thus erode checks and balances. Or executive orders are necessary for rapid changes in a fast-moving world. That's a general benefit. But I imagine that debaters will want to frame out, in other words, to exclude from the debate one or the other. So prepare framing defense to make sure your preferred type stays in the round, whatever you're using in your case, if you are using one or the other. Again, in truth, the most accurate way to answer the question posed by the resolution is to line up all 15,000 EOs, stack their harms and benefits, and see which one wins. Now, while this might seem obviously absurd, it also could be a strategy, and a novice rounds it just might work. The scattershot strategy. Each argument is a specific EO. Throw out 100 good things or 100 bad things and see how your opponent reacts. Again, preparing some good framing defense should let you win handily against such scattershot arguments. And maybe at the national topic level, this is kind of a moot point to be discussing these things, but not everyone's going to the national tournament. The specific harms and benefits approach also raises another question. What timeline are we talking about? If we go full history, the Emancipation Proclamation might single-handedly outrule everything else. Although that pushes us into definitions debate, as while it was functionally an EO, it was technically a proclamation. Other EO wins include desegregating the armed forces, establishing the Peace Corps, establishing equal opportunity rules, critical of cybersecurity and green energy EOs. Losses include notably internment of Japanese Americans, although that is also open for debate. But honestly, weigh the major EOs and you have to give a big win to AF, which is good because it might be the only thing AF has going for them. While there's plenty of history to rule on, the vast majority of evidence out there is on recent EOs from the last few presidencies, and very specifically from Trump's. This doesn't represent the true scope of executive orders overall, but it does represent where the online literature is at least. Many articles are about the modern, bloated nature of the executive order. For the highest quality debate rounds, I would recommend keeping your arguments to general harms and general benefits, while relying on the specific EOs as examples, not as arguments in and of themselves. And I want to be honest here, I don't know if that's actually what's going to win you rounds. Okay, I don't debate. I just know that that is the kind of round that I would want to watch. So, that is that. Another point. How about future EOs? This is a big point for many of the arguments that Neg will have. A lot of Neg's general arguments are executive orders give way too much power to the executive, to the president, and that's bad because we don't want a king. We're a democracy. We should want a system where even if a bad guy has all that power, it's still all right. But, again, that's not really what the resolution is asking. It's not asking if a bloated executive is good or bad. The resolution is asking about harms and benefits of EOs. So, what if you have sort of a philosopher king in power, where all of that power is used for good? With some very notable exceptions. Xi Jinping could be seen as that kind of a king. Certainly propagandistically, if you just get real like CCP pilled, that's what you might think of Xi Jinping. Like, he needs all that power, and this specifically is the guy to have all that power. Like, thank God that the divine mandate has given us this this philosopher king Xi Jinping to rule our country and raise us up out of poverty and reestablish China on the world order. So, maybe we need something like that for the U.S. And again, maybe Trump is that guy, at least from a certain point of view. I guess the point I'm making here is that just having a very, very strong executive is not enough. Okay, so we have a king. Is he doing anything bad? Or are the bad things he's doing more than the good things that he's doing and the things that have happened in the past? So I'm not sure that we can rely on a future time frame for thinking about the harms and benefits of executive orders, specifically the harms of an inflated executive. I don't know if the future counts, but again, that's a question open for debate. So think about this. Past EOs seem pretty much as good. Future EOs could be like really, really scary, but do either of those count? Another question in considering strategy, what's the alternative? If we didn't have EOs, would many of the same policies have been passed by Congress at some point anyway? How would the country have evolved differently? And how might the president's powers look different today? What kind of future harms might have been prevented? These are all interesting questions, although probably won't be directly addressed in round. This question, again, doesn't ask if we should abolish the EO. So what's the alternative is a great question. Probably not the right question for in round, especially because proving these counterfactuals may end up being close to impossible. Like if we hadn't had an EO till this point in history, what would it look like? That's way, way, way too complicated question to even begin to address. Okay. 2 shout-outs before arguments proper. First, to the Carthage Tigers debate team. Your coach tells me you watch these lectures, so thank you so much for your support. Second, to Owasso Speech and Debate in East Oklahoma. Thanks for keeping critical thinking alive in the Sooner State. I've only been to East Oklahoma once, but I certainly did have a time while there. Now, on to the AF section, which I can only describe as measly and paltry, but perhaps you have some other synonyms to add to the AF pile. Executive orders have enabled American presidents to accomplish great things, from emancipating Black Americans to advancing civil rights to providing AI, data, and missile security in recent years. The executive order allows U.S. presidents to act swiftly in the case of crises in our rapidly changing world and to act decisively when a gridlocked Congress fails to pass appropriate laws. Let's start with the specific benefits of executive orders. While this only represents a tiny fraction of the 15,000 mostly positive orders, it gives a good representation of what presidents have recently been able to achieve with EOs. 14110 allows government oversight of foundational AI models, in as far as AI is an existential threat to our economy, our way of life, our civilization, our biological humans themselves. We need to dramatically ramp up AI monitoring, and this EO does just that. 13873 prevents the bulk sale of U.S. data on U.S. citizens to foreign adversaries. Essentially, there are U.S.-based data brokers that have all of your information, including real-time location, credit scores, info from customer loyalty programs and social media platforms, and anyone can buy that info from the broker on the open market. This EO prevents those sales from happening with foreign adversaries of the U.S. Government waste. 14210, the DOGE EO, aims to shrink the federal government and reduce waste, cut spending, and increase efficiency. This will save taxpayer dollars and streamline federal government processes, thus also returning power to state and local governments. Counterintuitively, when put into the right hands, EOs can help to decentralize government power by giving it back to the people. That's from the White House. 14116, improved cyber security of the nation's ships and ports, including their supply chains and data systems. This has been a major vulnerability for some time, and only by executive order did we finally start to mend this major vulnerability. 14186 provides an iron dome for strategic missile defense for America, using space-based assets and cooperating with allies. This is revolutionary. We may one day be able to obviate many of the nuclear war impacts we hear in debate rounds, and to live life without fear of this particular existential threat. How do we even have the hope of such a world? The executive order. 14279 reforms the university accreditation system. One particularly hopeful change is making government student loans conditional on graduates being able to pay them back. This could be an important policy change in reducing unemployment and student loan debt. This rule would be radical as it sounds. Don't let students take out loans they won't be able to pay back. Sounds crazy, right? Big fan of responsibility in university loans. So, it's now clear that executive orders can handily bring benefits to all areas of American life. And by the way, these are just recent EOs. I've already gone over some of the past ones, but I just feel like reaching into history too far would make the AF side too overpowered, and we want to make it a fair debate for the neg side, not boring. So I'm not even going to bring it up, just to give the neg side the tiniest chance of winning. But that's not enough to justify the EOs. We must also emphasize that the executive order is beneficial in principle. Because in fact, the executive order is simply how the president instructs the executive branch. I already said it in the background section, but this question is almost absurd. Look, consider a world without the EO. What would we be left with? A president who can't make commands? The president would become a glorified HR manager, hiring the heads of department to run without oversight, without vision, without direction. In a way, again, it borders on absurdity. Does the neg team prefer a decentralized government with no direction or leadership at all? Are they advocating for anarchy? Sure seems like it. Even if negative does consider a utopian counterplan to be preferable, nothing but the executive order works in our actual world. Theoretically, Congress and the president could work in lockstep to manage the country, but in practice, Congress is notoriously gridlocked and unable to act. Without the executive order, the president would hardly be able to swoop in and save the day. Here's Garros21, quote, "In our current political climate, which is largely defined by political polarization and negative partisanships, presidents are likely to face obstruction from their political rivals in Congress, who are electorally incentivized to prevent the president from achieving their goals. For this reason, recent presidents have often come to rely on executive action as opposed to the formal legislative process in Congress to pursue their policy goals." End quote. The Purdue Policy Research Institute 21 affirms this virtue of the EO, quote, "Executive authority gives presidents first mover status in a political system designed to frustrate everybody's ambitions." End quote. One example of this comes from Jackson 24, who talks about data protection laws in the U.S. The U.S. desperately needs a federal privacy or data protection law. The absence of one threatens our national interests and national security. While we wait for Congress to take this issue seriously, the Biden administration seems to be looking to leverage its executive authorities to take action where it can. End quote. This power of the executive to launch initiatives as needed, at the pace of the world instead of the pace of Congress, is especially important in cases of crises. Thrower 21, quote, "They've been used to manage public lands, the economy, the civil service, and federal contractors, and to respond to various crises such as the Iran hostage situation and the COVID-19 pandemic." Now neg. Executive orders have grown to give more and more power to the president, unbalancing the system of checks that the Constitution lays out for the three branches of government. This does two damaging things. First, it creates unstable governance through the pendulum effect, with each administration upending the last administration's policies. And second, it gives the president the powers of the king, inviting autocracy as executive orders let presidents extend their reach far beyond their constitutional limits. There are hundreds of specific harms we could touch on. 9066 enabled the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. 6102 prohibited U.S. citizens from owning gold. And 9835 enabled the Red Scare. A series of EOs have given the executive branch almost king-like power, and another series has built the modern surveillance state. Yet that's not what I want to focus on today. Instead, let's narrow our focus to recent EOs and the damage they've caused, only under President Trump. My goal here is not to downplay the past wrongs, but but to demonstrate the harms that they cause, both now and in the future, the potential harms that can be caused by a single president using this sledgehammer of the EO to accomplish their evils. I'm not exactly sure the best way to categorize the flogging and decimation of American progress, so let's do it alphabetically. 11991 will vastly expand oil and gas interests, destroy successful clean energy projects, and launch an all-of-government assault on the environment and public health. Bopna 25, quote, "Nobody voted for this, but somebody else asked for it. The billionaire oil and gas donors Trump solicited to help bankroll his campaign. That's what this is all about. These executive orders constitute a grave and singular threat to public health, the economy, wild places, and our ability to confront the climate crisis." That should win, just by itself. President Trump has also misused executive orders in ways that harm civil rights, violate constitutional limits, and disproportionately impact vulnerable communities. You can find examples of these throughout his slate of first 100-day EOs. I think most Americans would prefer that someone like the president has power to handle situations in case of emergencies, at least. Yet we know from Trump 1 that he's happy to abuse these powers while in office. Goteen 23, quote, "In 2019, Donald Trump declared a national emergency. The declaration triggered a law that allowed him to divert funds from military construction projects, weapons maintenance shops, aircraft rescue and firefighting stations, cyber operations facilities. All were sidelined in favor of the border wall. The declaration was a clear abuse of emergency powers. For one thing, there was no sudden, unforeseen development of the border. Worse, Trump issued the declaration for the avowed purpose of getting around Congress. Recent executive orders have strained public health by cutting funding and discouraging vulnerable populations from seeking care." Dang 25. Quote, "Efforts to prevent disease, improve health outcomes, and address the social factors that impact health are directly undermined by policies that divide rather than unite." End quote. Say what you want about immigration law and border security, but we should be keeping the people residing in America healthy. Targeting of higher education through executive orders harms social responsibility, U.S. global leadership, and science funding. Trump has targeted institutions he thinks have personally offended him, including Columbia, U of Penn, Cornell, Harvard. There are over 50 universities that are under investigation for DEI-related practices. Executive orders also harm national parks, wildlife, and the environment, largely by opening even more national parks and public lands to drilling and development. EO 14288 decreases the already low level of police accountability in America, handing cops ever greater immunity to commit crime. When's the last time you thought, geez, when's the last time anyone thought, geez, cops have too much accountability? If there's one thing we need to reform about police, it's taking away some of the extreme oppressive accountability that's hanging over their shoulders. Misdial 25 sums it up. Great piece. Quote, "If you want to commit crimes in this country, the single best thing you can do for your criminal career is join the police. Trump is making it easier for police to get away with murder than ever before." And that's not just a turn of expression. In 2017, NEO mandated removing 2 regulations for each regulation added, creating congressional gridlock as agencies attempt to navigate this absurd demand. Most of these regulations, of course, were put there for good reason. So by forcing over-removal of regulations, this EO promises to end protections for physical harm, for environmental damage, for civil rights, for national security threats, and various financial and market failures. You know, you ever go into a business and there's a big list of rules, and you just know that each one of those rules came from a customer that did something just crazy and absurd? You know, like this is really common at gun ranges where obviously, you know, these things are very important. But you just think like, why would someone ever even do that? You know, like why would someone try to put some foreign object into a gun? You know, well, someone's done that before in that range, and now they have a rule for it. That's what a lot of these regulations are for, you know? Like building codes, they're not there just for fun or like because, you know, I don't know, we want a lot of control over you. Like buildings have killed people before, so we need building codes to make sure they don't kill people. You don't want to remove those regulations. Those aren't pesky. Those are there for a reason. But aside from all of the specific harms that the EO causes, it also brings gross dysfunction to the US government. First, executive orders can often prove to be ineffective. This isn't to negate all the harms that I've just brought up, but to say that in addition to being harmful, they're also unpredictable. That's even worse. So even if you want to try to do something good, there's a decent chance it won't happen. 3 reasons they're ineffective. First, mobilization. Although they declare intent, they're often not enough to achieve policy objectives by mobilizing the forces of government, like money and people, in a way that congressional law might do. For example, President Obama issued 13492, which aimed to close Guantanamo Bay. However, the facility is still open to this day. Second reason they are ineffective, overturn. Executive orders are often overturned by the next president. Brooks 25 says that this harms any chance of stability in government. Quote, executive orders are easily reversed, often causing a pendulum swing in policy that disrupts both the private sector and international relationships. Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement, entered via Obama's executive order, left global allies questioning America's reliability. Governing by pen often sacrifices durability and legitimacy for speed. Last reason that they're ineffective is on timeframes. Overturns incentivize presidents to govern on short time frames, often with little regard for long-term stability and consequences. Quote, presidents think almost exclusively in terms of unilateral executive actions, including executive orders. All of these can reinterpret existing regulatory statutes to align better with the current administration's policy preferences. This is no way to make policy in the world's leading economy. Regulatory uncertainty is the bane of sound planning and long-term capital investment. And yet there's no longer a will in Congress to tackle major regulatory issues, end quote. The ineffective nature of executive action leads to a number of impacts. First, investment. Under the constant threat of the EO pendulum coming to hit them, long-term investment becomes difficult for many crucial industries. Beck 25 cites green energy as just one example, including green energy credits, with large-scale green energy projects being built on the assumption that they'll gain certain government subsidies that are now being stripped away. Without these stable pricing controls, it becomes near impossible to plan large-scale projects for the long term. Another example, the scariest in current economic news, and I think a really, really good argument, is U.S. Treasuries. Countries buy American debt as it's the global reserve currency. Because our current president seems to have such spastic policy, the dollar market has shown troubling signs that they might start selling the dollar in favor of something more stable. That would be bad news for everyone. I think this capital flight argument, again, could be a huge impact for Khan. Look it up if you want to talk about US dollars and how having a crazy person as president with executive orders makes people not want to buy US dollars. Second impact, economy. If the pendulum destroys long-term investment and harms the economy. Bosch 21, quote, if major policies are reversed each time the presidency changes parties, then the private sector has a diminished ability to make confident decisions on long-term investments, hurting the prospects of future economic growth. When economic uncertainty is prevalent, customers spend less, businesses limit production, investment, and employee compensation, and financial markets are more volatile, end quote. Third, major challenges. The pendulum reduces the U.S.'s ability to address major long-term challenges. Again, Bosch 21, quote, the country will need to deal with significant issues, including addressing climate change and repairing and replacing major infrastructure. Both issues will require durable policies lasting beyond administrations. A better approach to these tough issues would involve legislative solutions instead of executive orders specifically tailored to addressing these challenges, end quote. Yet, despite these obvious flaws in the system, there's a more fundamental and nefarious way that executive orders harm our country, by providing a stage for the president to become king. Scroll your boat. The 3 branches of the American constitutional republic were set up so that no despot could take over. and so that nobody could become king. Executive orders threaten this system by enabling presidential abuse, reducing the separation of powers, and eroding checks and balances. Under the executive order, presidents simply can't be stopped. Congress seems powerless to check the president. Quote, when the president takes measures incompatible with the express or implied will of Congress, his power is at its lowest. Some observers believe that the Trump, Biden, and Obama presidencies overreached in both directions, ignoring existing laws and fashioning new ones. That's Levy 25. And the president does this often, with an increasing amount of legislation being written by the executive branch instead of Congress. Equally, the courts are powerless to check the president. Many presidential decisions are simply outside of their scope and authority, including wartime tactics and presidential pardons. Even if they're illegal, the courts are often powerless to act. Gaziano 19 gives the example of decisions made during an illegal war. Quote, whether the overall military action is authorized or not, a president's tactical military commands are committed to his sole discretion. Such tactical military commands simply are not subject to challenge, regardless of their effect on numerous people's lives, like millions of people's lives. End quote. Last, the independent agencies, which theoretically act outside the purview of the three branches of government despite being funded by Congress. Or we have agencies, yes. However, recent executive orders grant to the White House greater control and influence over how these previously independent agencies create regulation, allocate funds, and interpret laws. A lot of these are independent because they shouldn't be, things like monetary policy or, air quality shouldn't be politicized. Like having clean air, having sound monetary policy, that's not like a presidential or not like a Democrat or a Republican thing. Like these agencies should be able to regulate their areas of expertise independently of politics. But no longer can they do that. This bloated executive leads to three impacts. None of these are terminal, but all of these are solid arguments. First, democracy. The reason for the U.S.'s separation of powers is to uphold democracy. So when EU step in to hurt this separation, guess what? They also harm democracy. Here's from the appropriately called Democratic Erosion Consortium 22. Democracies are built upon a few key ideals, one of which is the enactment of checks and balances in the government in order to preserve excessive executive power. Executive orders exemplify the exact opposite. And Brigade 25. What was once a last resort after negotiations with Congress failed is now the first arrow pulled out of the president's quiver. Today, candidates don't even pretend they'll work with Congress. The consequences of continuing down this path are clear. Power concentrated in the executive branch is power lost to the people. Impact 2, corporatism. EOs enable corporatism, allowing presidents to easily elevate their cronies and friends instead of the American people in the country. For example, Trump's executive orders undermine environmental protections and public health in favor of fossil fuel companies. Quote, the Trump administration has utilized executive orders to block clean energy projects, bolster fossil fuel emissions, and roll back environmental safeguards, all damaging to human and environmental health. He promised tax cuts for the wealthy and made undisclosed promises to oil and gas industry donors, whom he asked to spend $1 billion on his 2024 presidential campaign, calling it a deal for what they would avoid in taxation and regulation. Just open corruption. And made possible through the EO. Third impact, it fuels imperialism. Again, the president has nearly ultimate control over the military. In an emergency, which he can declare via EO at any time, he gets even more control. It's not the case that the EO is the only tool at the imperialist president's disposal, but it is a powerful one. For example, 13303, this executive order from 2003 allows the U.S. to exercise complete control over Iraq's oil revenues. The system perpetuates instability, corruption, and high levels of debt. Here's Askari 24 talking about how we steal all of Iraq's money. Quote, since the signing of Executive Order 13303 by President George W. Bush, all revenues from Iraq's oil sales have been funneled directly into an account at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The Iraq Ministry of Finance has to submit requests for funds to the U.S. Treasury, which then approves or denies these requests based on its own criteria. This monthly transfer of U.S. dollars, which are literally flown into Baghdad in pallets of hard cash, determines Iraq and its 40 million population's ability to pay for basic needs like salaries, food, and medicine. End quote. Crazy. This EO has been in place since 2003 and has been renewed by every president since. Again, a lot of these powers are hard to roll back. These are just some of the impacts of the inflated executive branch. But where this leads is something darker yet, something people are both talking about and very reasonably concerned about. We can call it whatever we'd like: the American king, the emergent authoritarian. Fascism is probably the word that most accurately describes where the MAGA movement is headed. If you lay out the tenets of fascism, a fair number of Trump supporters will be on board. And Trump himself is a textbook demagogue. But for this final argument, I will rein this all in a bit with the sterile but descriptive label, autocracy. Executive orders are made for a demagogue to abuse. From the Democratic Erosion Consortium 22, demagogues are known for avoiding a conversational and rational debates. Executive orders create a path around the need for people to defend their ideas. End quote. And once the rational debate is deftly avoided, that leaves plenty of room for anything. Because under the National Emergencies Act, the president is granted even more authoritarian levels of power via executive order. Brennan Center for Justice. 123 statutory authorities become available to the president when he declares a national emergency. Many are sensible, but others seem like the stuff of authoritarian regimes, giving the president power to take over domestic communication, seize Americans' bank accounts, and deploy U.S. troops to any foreign country. The National Emergency Act allows the president to declare emergencies with nothing more than a signature on an executive order. End quote. We see Trump using this extreme executive order-derived power even now in classic authoritarian fashion. Catch it all, 25, quote, "We have witnessed an unprecedented effort by the new administration, including through recent executive orders to target American higher education institutions. These threats to American freedom follow a familiar pattern, reminiscent of autocracies globally, signaling out activists and entities among civil society, including universities, is central to the autocratic playbook." End quote. And lest you imagine that EOs will stay limited to intellectual attacks or soft coercion, these recent EOs have actually pushed us closer to martial law. Quote, "Donald Trump has issued an executive order that will make it even harder to hold cops accountable and flirts blatantly with martial law. The order instructs the Secretary of Defense to determine how military and national security assets can most effectively be utilized to prevent crime." This sounds an awful lot like the prelude to martial law, a framework where national military assets are deployed in American cities to enforce the president's priorities. End quote. Truly terrifying stuff. But again, I'm really happy we can get these discussions out in the open, while it's still legal, I guess. And especially at the time that we need to be having them. So, although this topic itself is tough to get a handle on, although I trust you fine debaters will do a better job than I have, honestly, I'll give the wording committee a break after probably my favorite season of topics since I started following them 8 years ago. Mexico border wall, Taiwan military, Somaliland, that was cool, war crimes, AI in education. I love that, AI in education. What a great topic. And nuclear energy. Y'all have just not missed this season. Not much, anyway. Okay, finally, a brief send-off for seniors and whatever wisdom I have for the rest of you. If YouTube statistics can be trusted, you're probably in the top 10% of human capability. That's based on your passport, your class status, your intellect, and your education. As a member of Gen Z, you're in the top 5%. That is based on this moment in history, the amount of leverage that technology gives you, and the time you have left in your natural life. But as a debater, you're in the top 1%. And maybe much higher. That's because you have a broad depth of knowledge about the world and how U.S. policy plays into pressing issues. So in other words, you not only have intellect and resources and time on your side, but you have the knowledge to place those things into an area that will balloon your impact in the world. You are powerful. And I don't mean to be trite about this. analytically, rationally, statistically, you are powerful. We all know what Uncle Ben had to say about great power. Whatever your plans, whatever your plan, major or lack of major, planned career, planned gap year, whatever you're planning to do, I invite you to take a look at the ideas behind 80,000 hours. It's not about guilt or chasing prestige. It's about asking, how can I do the most good with the career that I choose? With the 80,000 hours or 100,000 hours or 120,000 hours that you may spend working on something. When Gandalf showed up to the Shire with the ring, he didn't give Frodo a personality test or a career assessment. And here's something really important. He didn't ask the question, what do you want to do? What do you want to be? He didn't ask that. He said, this is what needs to be done. And that is what 80,000 hours work delivers. These are the issues that people need to work on. So go, work on them. There's a link in the description. If you want to talk through what this looks like, how to get from high school to saving the world, my Instagram DMs are always open. So is my email inbox. I can't promise I can help, but I can promise to try. Thanks for being here.